On a stretch of Rocky Mountain Pass where the last bar of signal had died 3 miles back, 2 black SUVs closed on Jasmine Holloway's limousine like a pair of jaws. The one ahead swung across the lane. The one behind sealed the road they'd come from. On the radio, the security escort that should have been calling out every second had gone into a silence that wasn't natural. Not lost reception, but something compressed, something deliberately squeezed shut. Jasmine, a woman who ran a billion-dollar industrial empire and was used to making entire boardrooms sit down with her voice, gave the order she always gave. "Stop the car. I'll talk to them." Wyatt Crane did not stop. He reached back, pulled her down off the seat, and pressed her flat against the floor, then cut the wheel hard to the left. The limousine slid its rear end across the rain-soaked surface and shot into a narrow service road, hidden behind a drainage barrier, a passage no commercial map recorded. The 2 SUVs could not follow. The concrete channel was too tight, a clearance he had measured by eye long before the moment ever arrived. When she pushed herself up, hair loose, her voice losing for the first time the calm she wore like armor, she asked him the only question that mattered. Where does a broke driver learn to move like that? Wyatt kept his eyes on the dark road and his hands on the wheel, and he said only one thing. "Before I drove a CEO, I used to bring people home alive." If you believe that an exhausted single father can still carry an extraordinary past hidden inside him, stay with us, because this rescue is only just beginning. 3 weeks before that night, on the morning he drove to the Holloway Tower for his interview, Wyatt Crane wore the only charcoal suit he owned, the one he had worn to his wife's funeral 2 years earlier, pressed flat and buttoned at the collar. The night before, he and his son Noah, 7 years old, had slept in their old pickup truck in the dark corner of a parking lot. On the passenger seat sat a small insulated bag holding the boy's heart medication, the kind that spoiled if it wasn't kept at the right temperature. Wyatt had stayed awake most of the night, making sure the bag never tipped over. He had not applied out of pride. He had applied because he had run out of every other road. The lobby of the Holloway Tower shone like a frozen lake, marble floors throwing back the morning light. The other candidates waited on a row of low chairs in tailored suits and polished shoes, wearing the rehearsed stillness of men who had learned to look useful rather than be useful. Wyatt sat at the end of the row, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes moving across the exits and the lines of sight the way other people scanned their phones. He had counted the doors before he had counted the candidates. When his turn came, an assistant led him down to the vehicle bay and asked him to demonstrate a standard pickup sequence. Open the door, settle the principal, confirm the route. It was a simple thing, the kind of task that was supposed to take less than a minute. Wyatt did not open the door. He walked the length of the car first. He crouched once at the rear right wheel, tilted his head toward the front wheel well, ran 2 fingers along the seam of the bumper. Hank Delgado, the man who ran Jasmine Holloway's security, stood 6 feet away with his arms folded and the expression of someone who had watched this kind of theater before and was no longer moved by it. But Wyatt was not performing. He stood and spoke without apology and without inflation. "The rear right tire is running below the safe threshold. I'm not moving a vehicle with a passenger in it until that's corrected." The technician checked the gauge. The reading matched what he had said. Hank's expression shifted by the smallest possible degree, and Wyatt did not turn to confirm that it had. His military record, Hank already knew, had been sealed for years, and behind it sat a closed internal inquiry that had never been resolved. It hung in the air as a question with 2 answers: a reason to disqualify the man, or a reason to look at him more carefully, depending entirely on how a person chose to think about things like that. Jasmine appeared in the bay doorway when the delay ran long, a coffee in one hand and the particular stillness of a woman who ran meetings rather than waited for them. She studied him the way she studied an anomaly in a financial report, methodically, without commitment, looking for the pattern that would tell her what she was actually looking at. She asked him whether he always slowed schedules down like this. He told her he only did it when the schedule was moving faster than the safety margin could hold. There was no charm in the answer, no effort to be liked. On the road test that followed, he identified construction staging on the main route and rerouted before anyone asked him to. When she changed the destination mid-trip without warning, he adjusted his line without a word and arrived with time to spare. When he returned the car to the bay, he parked it nose out, the habit of a man who never wanted to reverse in a hurry. Jasmine hired him before the day was over. She did not know he had once been Delta Force. She hired him because he was the only candidate who had checked the tires, and because when she asked him a direct question, he gave her a direct answer, a combination that had turned out to be rarer at every income level than she had expected. The first week taught Wyatt more about Jasmine Holloway's world than the job description had suggested it would. Her schedule changed 3 times before noon every day, not out of chaos, but out of control. She moved her own calendar like a chess clock, pushing meetings forward or back to manufacture an advantage most of the people around her never noticed she was building. Every person who approached the car at the curb wanted something from the approach. A briefing delivered where no one could interrupt. A request slipped in while she was in motion and had nowhere to redirect her attention. A compliment dressed as small talk that was really a survey of her mood. Wyatt absorbed all of it from the front seat without remark. He watched the mirrors, cataloged the patterns, and kept the interior temperature at the exact level she had mentioned once and never repeated. He held a distance that was calibrated rather than trained, near enough to act, far enough not to crowd. On his lunch break the second day, he sat in his pickup in the structure beneath the tower and called his son. He arranged Noah's next cardiology appointment, the follow-up the boy could not afford to miss, and worked out in his head how much of his first paycheck would cover which part of the hospital debt. He kept his voice light enough to hide that the two of them were still living in a motel that charged by the week, a room with a door that didn't lock right, and a heater that rattled all night. "You don't have to worry about any of it," he told the boy. "I've got it handled." Jasmine passed the truck on her way to a coffee meeting and caught only the register of it, the careful voice of a man trying not to frighten the person on the other end. She did not ask. She filed it. What she noticed over those first 10 days was what he did not do. He did not ask about holiday bonuses. He did not repeat conversations from the car to the rest of the staff. He did not close the gap between driver and passenger with talk designed to make himself memorable. Her protection team kept their proximity through protocol. Wyatt kept his through judgment, and the difference was visible to anyone who had spent enough years watching people paid to pretend beside people who simply knew. He saw things she did not see. The escort detail changed its formation without updating her. The vehicle bay's entry log was signed by hand and never cross-referenced against the electronic keycard system. Schedule details moved through channels far wider than the information they carried required. One morning, he watched a maintenance vendor sign himself in under a name that did not match the credential clipped to his jacket, and no one checked. He noted all of it and said nothing because his job was to drive, and driving was what he did. A man in his position did not get to be right out loud. He had learned that lesson long before he ever wore a charcoal suit to a funeral, and he had learned it again, more slowly and more painfully, in the years since. So he kept the observations where he kept everything else that could not yet be proven, written down, dated and waiting for the third instance that would turn a worry into a fact. After a board dinner on a Wednesday in late October, as Wyatt pulled out of the structure onto the avenue, he noticed a gray sedan parked across the street. He would not have thought anything of it if he had not seen the same car that morning outside the riverfront office. And again at noon, near the entrance of the club where Jasmine took her lunch, the same gray sedan in a different position, the same height of driver pressed into the headrest profile. He said nothing. He needed a third instance before he would say anything. Once was noise, twice was correlation, 3 times was a pattern worth treating as a fact. By the end of the following week, he had 3 separate location entries for the same 4-door gray sedan. A hairline scratch on the passenger side front bumper caught at different angles in the mirrors, on entirely different routes, at different hours of the day. He logged the estimated driver height from the seat position, the behavior of holding a constant following distance rather than accelerating naturally through traffic, and the fact that the car had appeared twice after route changes that had never been communicated outside the vehicle. He compiled it the way he had once compiled relevant intelligence, specific, attributed, free of any conclusion he could not support with documentation, and gave it to Hank Delgado. Hank ran the partial plate through the channels available to him and came back the next afternoon. It matched a rental with no flag on record, a category that covered thousands of cars in the city on any given day. He thanked Wyatt in the tone of a man professionally obligated not to dismiss a subordinate who had effectively already been dismissed, and offered the explanation that high-profile executives drew this kind of attention from competitors, journalists, and research firms, none of whom, he said, amounted to an actionable threat. Wyatt acknowledged the answer and said nothing further. The next morning he changed the route to Jasmine's first meeting without advance notice, taking a variation that bypassed the usual approach by 6 blocks. The gray sedan appeared at the secondary exit. There was no way to know the alternate route unless someone had access to the tracking data from the navigation system or had been told by someone inside the scheduling chain. Wyatt understood then that the problem was not a stranger on the street. The problem had a key. That night, in the lower level of the estate, after the rest of the staff had gone, he swept the undercarriage of the limousine with a magnetic detection tool he had bought that afternoon from a commercial security supplier and paid for in cash he could not afford to spend. 22 minutes in, he found it. A small tracking unit mounted above the rear axle housing, sealed in a weatherproof case, transmitting on a frequency the estate's fleet system did not use. He did not pry it loose. He crouched there in the cold concrete light and looked at the adhesive. Its cure state told him the device had been placed recently during a window when the car sat in the bay and the bay was accessible. It had not arrived there by accident, and it had not been placed by anyone who did not already belong inside. This time Hank Delgado did not wave it off. He came down to the lower level himself, photographed the device in place, removed it with gloved hands, and sealed it in an evidence bag while making calls. His expression, for the first time since Wyatt's arrival, carried the quality of a professional who had found a problem he could not file under routine. Access to the undercarriage required either a key card for the lower bay or an escort credential for a maintenance vendor, which narrowed the list of people who could have placed it to 8 individuals across 3 categories: maintenance crew, the executive protection team, and senior administrative staff with bay clearance. Dean Kowalski, Hank's own deputy, was on that list. Neither man said the name out loud. Naming a suspect before you had evidence was how an investigation became personal, and personal was how it became dangerous. What they did agree on was that the circle of people who received Jasmine's schedule would shrink immediately, implemented without explanation to the people it excluded. Jasmine was spending those same days fighting a battle of her own. The board had before it a proposed sale of the Sentinel Logistics Division, the logistics intelligence arm of Holloway Industrial, to an investment vehicle whose ownership traced through 4 holding companies before it arrived at an entity registered in a jurisdiction that required no public disclosure. The offered price sat below internal valuation by a margin too large for any standard discount model to explain. Her uncle, Preston Vance, had been pressing the vote forward for 6 weeks, collecting proxy commitments from members she had not personally lobbied, scheduling confirmation calls during the hours he knew she was unavailable. She had found two of the anomalies herself, running the numbers on a flight home from a conference, arriving at the kind of figure that turned a question from financial into legal. The data was specific enough that she had begun building a private evidentiary file before saying a word to anyone. The same instinct that ran underneath everything she did. The belief that the fastest way to neutralize her was to feed her incomplete information. Buried in the board charter was the clause that made the timing matter. If the chief executive became unreachable for 48 hours, an emergency authorization provision allowed the board, on a quorum's judgment, to activate the proxy votes Preston had spent 6 weeks assembling. Jasmine had read the clause years ago and never imagined it as a weapon. She read it differently now. That night, the lower bay camera lost its signal for exactly 12 minutes between 11:47 and 11:59. The feed was restored without an incident report ever being filed. Dean Kowalski was the only member of the team with remote override access to the bay's camera relay. Hank checked the log twice because a man with 22 years of habit did not trust a thing he had only read once, and the log said the same thing both times. The blackout had not been a malfunction. It had been a decision made by someone who knew precisely how long he needed the dark to last. The anonymous call came at 17 minutes past 9 that evening, routed through a masked number to Wyatt's personal phone. The voice was calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who believed he was making an offer rather than delivering a threat. Drive Friday's route without deviation. Don't alert anyone. Do that, and his son would never have any reason to know anything had happened at all. Wyatt listened to the recording twice. He wrote down every word in the order it had been spoken. Then he set the phone face down on his knee and sat very still, because the only thing in his life that could be used against him had just been named by a stranger, and he needed a moment to absorb that the wound was as clean and exact as a man could make it. He called Noah's motel room. The boy was awake, halfway through a workbook, the small pill organizer open on the nightstand for his evening dose. They talked for 40 seconds, about a drawing of a rocket, about whether the heater would behave tonight, about nothing that mattered to anyone except the two people on the line. Wyatt asked him to put the chain on the door before bed. Noah said he always did. The boy's voice was bright and unworried, entirely unaware that his name had just been spoken in a room he had never seen, and that brightness was the thing that decided it. A man who had buried his wife and kept only his son did not negotiate over the one thing he had left. He made his decision the way he had always made decisions under pressure, fast, with the next 2 steps already mapped before he moved. He told Jasmine the next morning, plainly, as a data point she deserved to hold. Her response was immediate and genuine. She offered the estate's guest accommodations for Noah, a full protective detail, around-the-clock monitoring, the entire architecture of safety that her money could assemble in an afternoon. He declined. He explained that the call had been designed to produce exactly that response. Fear translated into consolidation, a smaller perimeter that someone on the inside could then control. Jasmine called him inflexible. He said she was proposing to make his son part of her fortress, and that protecting Noah did not require accepting the threat's own frame. It required making the threat irrelevant instead. The conversation was direct and honest in the way conversations can only be between two people who do not manipulate each other, and afterward she sat for a long time thinking about the difference between the people who protected her because they were paid to, and the one man who had just refused her help because it would have been the wrong kind. Wyatt brought the recording to Hank, filed a formal report through the state's emergency protocol, and established a record on the non-emergency line as well. He did not mention his operational history. He mentioned what had happened, and that was enough. Hank traced the originating relay to a disposable device activated within 2 blocks of the estate security office, 2 blocks from Dean Kowalski's own desk. Noah's school and his cardiology clinic were notified quietly through a third-party contact, advised to vary routines as a standard precaution, asked nothing that the framing could not satisfy. The boy was not moved, not placed under visible guard, not inserted into the threat's design as a piece someone else could push. He stayed exactly where he was, and he never knew there had been a reason to be afraid. Friday was the scheduled document signing at a resort high in the mountains, the exact timetable and route the caller had told Wyatt not to change. Jasmine decided to keep the appointment. She had never operated from concealment, and she believed, with the conviction of a woman who had won more confrontations than she had lost, that the answer to being threatened was not to become less visible, but to become more armored with fact. She would arrive where they expected her, when they expected her, carrying everything she needed to make the trap close on the people who set it. The convoy assembled at 7:30. An advance vehicle carried 2 protection officers. The limousine carried Wyatt and Jasmine. A trailing vehicle ran under Dean Kowalski's direct command. The departure time had moved through the standard scheduling channel, the way it always did. They were 40 minutes out of the city when the advance vehicle turned off the agreed route, its driver reporting an incident ahead that required a deviation. The transmission was followed immediately by static, and Wyatt heard at once that it was the wrong kind. The frequency was being compressed, not degraded. Someone was squeezing the channel shut rather than losing it to weather or terrain. His hands did not move from the wheel, but his eyes moved constantly between the mirror and the road, and what he saw over the next 90 seconds confirmed what the static had already told him. A black SUV slid into close following distance behind them, its front grille riding at the wrong height for a civilian vehicle. Ahead, a second SUV angled across both lanes out of a maintenance pullout, sealing the forward path in a geometry that left the limousine perhaps 4 car lengths of stopping room. Jasmine told him to stop, calmly and clearly, the way she issued every directive she believed authority could resolve. Wyatt told her to get down and stay down, and his voice carried the quality that does not wait for agreement before it proceeds. He did not drive into either vehicle. He cut the wheel and reversed in a controlled arc into a narrow service road, whose entrance was half hidden behind a drainage barrier, a passage that appeared on no commercial map, present only in the maintenance survey data he had downloaded and memorized 3 days earlier. He had measured the clearance of the concrete channel markers in advance. The SUVs could not follow without scraping them, and they knew it before they tried. He drove the rutted, rain-soaked surface the way a man drives terrain he has already decided he can manage, committed and precise, while Jasmine stayed pressed behind the rear headrest without a single question, which told him how completely she had decided to trust him in the moment that mattered. Then he reached down and shut off the vehicle's commercial GPS so no one monitoring the fleet system could read their position. From the door pocket, he drew a personal satellite emergency beacon he had placed there 3 days before, a unit registered to a contact entirely outside the estate's network, and activated it. The fleet would show the limousine vanishing into a dead zone. The beacon would tell exactly one person where they actually were. Behind them, the headlights of both SUVs swung uselessly along the main road, searching a route their quarry was no longer on. 3 miles along the access road, at a decommissioned Ranger checkpoint, Wyatt stopped the limousine beside a parked maintenance vehicle, walked Jasmine inside the one-room structure, and locked the car. The building held a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a wall of faded survey maps. A generator coughed to life and threw a thin yellow light across all of it. It was there, checking her hands for injury under that light, that he found her phone running abnormally hot for a device in sleep mode, the signature of a continuous background process. He ran a standard diagnostic and identified a monitoring application authenticated with a certificate that belonged to the protection team's internal system. Someone on the team had installed surveillance software on the chief executive's personal phone. The certificate timestamp was 3 weeks old, which meant it had been listening since before the first gray sedan ever appeared in his mirrors. Jasmine did with the discovery what she did with all involuntary stillness. She worked the problem. She laid the conspiracy out across the folding table the way she would lay out a hostile acquisition analysis, structured, sequenced, without the inflation of fear. The 48-hour window. The emergency authorization clause that let a quorum activate the proxy votes if she was unreachable. The acquisition fund whose ownership layers pointed back eventually toward the personal legal office of Preston Vance. The narrative waiting at the end of it. A CEO who had vanished under stress, abandoned her security detail, and would be described on her return as unstable enough that her authority should be limited even after she walked back through the door. Wyatt listened without interrupting, then added the one piece she could not have seen from inside the car. The route change today had been made by Kowalski, not Hank. Hank had proposed a different approach and been overridden at the 40-minute mark. Hank was clean. The man she might have suspected first was the one who had been trying to keep her on the safer road. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something she had never said to anyone she paid. She did not know how to trust a thing she had not purchased, structured, or verified in advance. He looked at her across the generator light and told her the truth he had been living by long before he ever met her. When a person is in your car, the moment your responsibility for them ends is not written on a paycheck. Then the backup radio crackled, and Hank Delgado's voice came through, compressed and low. Do not call the city police. Kowalski controls that communication line. Wyatt did not answer right away. He verified Hank's identity through a challenge phrase set with a pre-departure attendant, a procedural detail he had retained not because he expected to need it, but because retaining procedural details was a habit older than any specific threat. The response came back correct. He told Jasmine they had a confirmed channel, and he told her where they were going. 2 years earlier, he had helped coordinate a search and rescue exercise near these foothills, and the county sheriff, Tom Bishop, had handed him a direct number with the instruction that certain situations called for a person rather than a department. Bishop's mountain station sat outside the city grid, outside Kowalski's reach, and outside every system that had already been turned against her. Wyatt folded the survey map to the route he wanted, picked up the beacon, and put the woman who could not trust anything she hadn't verified into a borrowed vehicle she had no way to check, because for the first time in her life, the only thing she could verify was the man holding the door. By the following morning, the story had reached 3 financial news outlets, released by a source described as a concerned board member. A newly hired driver with a partially sealed military record had separated Jasmine Holloway from her security detail on the day of a critical signing. The limousine had been abandoned on a service road. A compensation document had been recovered connecting the driver to an undisclosed arrangement, and the chief executive's location was unknown. Deputies at Sheriff Tom Bishop's station had located the abandoned SUV 3 miles down the county road overnight. Both occupants gone on foot into the tree line, and one of them had left behind a sealed folder. Inside was a document on Holloway industrial letterhead describing a payment to Wyatt Crane, by name, in exchange for ensuring continuity of the executive schedule for a 48-hour period. The figure was $1 million. The signature line was blank. It was the most useful thing they had found, because fabricated paper trails only get built by people who expect to need them. Preston Vance moved the board meeting forward by 12 hours, citing the emergency authorization language and the testimony of a fabricated incident report, declaring that a quorum would convene to stabilize the company while the situation was assessed. Jasmine refused to remain out of contact. She understood what the clock was doing. Every hour she was not publicly present and demonstrably capable was an hour the unreachable argument grew more credible, and credibility in a boardroom did not require proof, only repetition. From Bishop's station she recorded a statement on a county tablet. She was safe in direct communication with law enforcement and had left the convoy voluntarily because it had been compromised from inside. She transmitted it, with a compressed file of everything assembled through the night, to her attorney Vivian Cho through an encrypted line Bishop provided. Then she drove back into the city and walked through the front doors of her own building. Not the service entrance, not the back corridor, the main lobby, in full view, because arriving any other way would be described as the behavior of someone who had been coached to hide, and she was not hiding. Deputies in civilian dress controlled the entry. Dean Kowalski was detained in that lobby 17 minutes before she reached the elevator. She walked into the conference room while Preston was midway through his third premise. She set a flat document case on the table, acknowledged 3 members by their first names, and sat in her chair. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has shifted that everyone can feel, but no one can yet name. She presented it all, in sequence. The tracking device and its installation window, the monitoring software and its internal certificate, Kowalski's route change log beside Hank's overridden recommendation, the 12-minute camera blackout, and the remote command that matched it. The unsigned million-dollar contract, the financial mapping Vivian Cho had traced through 4 jurisdictions to Preston's chief of staff, and the written statement of Aaron Pruitt, who confirmed that 2 anomaly reports on the Sentinel sale had been flagged internally and suppressed under pressure from Preston's office. Hank Delgado confirmed each security artifact item by item. Preston said he had never intended for anyone to be endangered, that his objective had been the company's long-term interest. Jasmine said that a plan requiring her to be incapacitated for 48 hours, removed from communication, and afterward described as unstable, was not a business decision. It was an action against her liberty, and attaching corporate strategy to it did not change what it was. The board voted to suspend Preston Vance pending a full independent investigation. The Sentinel Logistics sale was halted immediately, and a forensic audit of the company's governance communications was authorized before the meeting even adjourned. Dean Kowalski was charged that afternoon on counts that Vivian Cho's office had helped frame. Wyatt gave his statement out in the corridor beside a deputy and a county investigator. He described only the documentable sequence of events, from the morning he first noted the gray sedan to the moment he handed the tracking unit to Hank. Everything confirmable by a timestamp, a recording, or a physical artifact. When the investigator asked about his military background, Wyatt said his record was available through the appropriate federal channels and that nothing in it was relevant because he had performed no act in those hours that required special training. He had driven carefully, preserved evidence carefully, and called the right people. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine quietly helped clear the old internal inquiry that had shadowed his name and his veterans' benefits. Frozen for 2 years over a paperwork dispute, were finally restored. That same evening she offered him the directorship of her personal security, a position that would have erased every dollar of his debt and changed the entire shape of Noah's future. He declined. He did not decline with drama. He sat in a chair in her office with the late light coming through the windows and told her the reason he had left Special Operations was not that he had run out of capability. It was that he had run out of willingness to live in a permanent state of readiness, to keep a mission schedule pinned against every personal decision. He had been deployed when his wife Hannah received her first diagnosis and in a briefing room when she received her second. He had made it home for the third. He did not want the rest of his life defined by a readiness posture, even a well-paid one. She listened without redirecting him, which was how he knew she had truly heard it. He agreed only to a part-time advisory role, reviewing transportation security on terms he set for a 6-month trial. 6 months later, Preston Vance had been removed from the board by a shareholder vote that carried by a margin too large to argue with. The company published a voluntary disclosure of its governance and authorization protocols, an unusual transparency that did not, as the skeptics had predicted, harm the stock. And in a hospital across town, Noah Crane came through his heart surgery, the operation his father had carried like a stone for 2 years, and woke up on the far side of it with a future that finally opened forward instead of closing in. Wyatt paid off the last of the medical debt, opened a small consulting office near the industrial district, and rebuilt the engine of Hannah's old car rather than sell it until it ran with the quiet reliability that was its own kind of testimony. On an afternoon in April, Jasmine didn't send a route to her security team. She called Wyatt. He arrived in the rebuilt car, and she looked at it a moment and asked whether a woman of her profile could ride in something like that and still be safe. He said safety had never come from what a car cost. She opened the front passenger door and sat down. He asked if she was certain. Clients usually preferred the back seat. She said this was not a client arrangement. They drove up to a high point above the reservoir, where the water held the last of the day's light. She told him she had believed for a long time that his sealed record was the thing that made him extraordinary. She understood now that the more extraordinary thing was simpler. He had all of that capacity, and he had never once used it to make her smaller. She asked if he was going to stay this time. Wyatt looked out at the light going low and warm over the water and said he didn't have anywhere left to run to. And the woman who had once hired a broke single father because he was the only one willing to say the car wasn't safe finally understood what she had found. A man who knew how to bring people home alive and had decided at last that home could include himself. What this story leaves us with is something quiet but worth holding on to. Real strength is not measured by what a person is capable of doing to others, but by the restraint to never use that power to diminish the people around them. The most extraordinary thing in any of us is not our hidden capability, but our willingness to stay, to protect, and to choose the people we love over the endless posture of being needed elsewhere. Wyatt could have run 100 times. He stayed because responsibility, real responsibility, does not end where a paycheck ends. If this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can carry extraordinary hearts. We would truly love to hear from you, so tell us in the comments how this story made you feel and how it connects to your own life. Has there been someone in your life who quietly protected you, asked for nothing, and chose to stay? Share it with us, because we read your words and we treasure the feelings you trust us with. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. We wish every one of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.